July 17, 1943, Camp Swift, Texas. The morning sun had already burned the dew off the wire fences by the time the convoy of gray army trucks arrived at the main gate. Each carried a dozen German prisoners still in field gray uniforms. Though most had been stripped of insignia, they were the latest arrivals from North Africa, captured in Tunisia in May, men of the Afrika Korps veterans of desert warfare, who now found themselves rolling through the green hills of central Texas. The trucks stopped beside the registration building, a wooden barrack painted in fresh olive drab. Two military police guards with white helmets waved the men out one by one. The prisoners lined up under the open sky, hands behind their backs, staring at a scene none of them had imagined after surrender. A baseball diamond? Beyond the wire, two American soldiers were playing catch, their khaki shirts, dark with sweat. Each throw popping into the glove with the flat smack of leather. The Germans watched silently as a ball arced high against the sun and dropped neatly into the waiting mitt. For a moment, it didn't look like war. It looked like a holiday. But for the prisoners, it was their first shock of America's casual normalcy. No guards shouting, no dogs, just a game played beside a camp that would soon hold thousands of them. The camp commandant, Lieutenant Colonel William McKinley, a former schoolteacher from Iowa, greeted the prisoners through an interpreter. He explained the rules clearly. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. They would work, they would receive pay in canteen coupons, and they would have access to recreation. The last word caught several men off guard. Recreation in wartime was a foreign idea to them. McKinley pointed to the open field beyond the barracks. Baseball diamond volleyball nets and wooden benches. He said in slow, deliberate English, "You are soldiers, but also men, and men need to move." Within weeks, Camp Swift's population exceeded 10,000. Most of them Afrika Korps and Luftwaffe personnel. The War Department had begun distributing prisoners across the American interior to relieve overcrowding on the coasts. Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas alone held over 100,000 Germans by the end of 1944. Each camp followed a similar design: double rows of fencing guard towers, barracks, kitchens, workshops, and a recreation field. The field was not decoration, it was policy. The U.S. Army believed that structured physical activity reduced escape attempts and maintained order for American guards. It meant fewer fights for the prisoners. It became their first introduction to the rhythm of American life. By late August, the Germans had organized soccer matches using improvised goals made from scrap lumber. They played barefoot at first until the camp supply officer approved requests for athletic shoes and uniforms. Through the Red Cross, soccer was familiar to them, but baseball was something entirely new. They watched Americans play in the evenings after work, teams made up of guards, clerks, and supply drivers. The rules seemed impossible to follow. The field diamond-shaped, the scoring arbitrary, the bat and ball alien one. POW later wrote in his diary, "We thought it was children's play until we saw how serious they were about it." The guards eventually noticed the curiosity and invited a few prisoners to join a practice session. Language was a barrier, but gestures worked. A corporal tossed a ball to a young German private who caught it barehanded and winced at the sting of impact. Laughter followed. Within days, small groups of POWs were attending informal lessons on the field, where American soldiers explained the basics. 3 strikes, 9 innings, bases 90 feet apart. One German sergeant compared it to cricket, simplified and accelerated. He wrote home that the Americans measure life in innings, not in hours. The War Department's Recreation Manual for Prisoner of War Camps, issued in September 1943, specifically encouraged baseball because it required teamwork, physical exertion, and, importantly, no expensive equipment. Bats and gloves could be made in camp workshops from local materials. By the end of the year, baseball had spread through dozens of POW camps from Georgia to Colorado. German prisoners practiced in their spare hours between agricultural work shifts. What began as curiosity became competition. Letters intercepted by censors later revealed how deeply the impression ran. One prisoner wrote to his wife in Württemberg, "They play a strange game with a stick and a ball, but the discipline is beautiful. Everyone waits his turn and no one cheats." Another wrote, "It is like life here, each man runs as far as he can, and then another helps him home." By winter 1943, baseball was no longer a spectator sport for the Germans. It had become their own pastime. The camp newspaper printed schedules for weekend games between teams named for cities. In their imagination, Berlin, Tigers, Hamburg, Eagles, Munich, Giants, American Guards attended and occasionally played alongside them. An Iowa newspaper visiting the camp described a match between German POWs and American military police. The headline read, "Prisoners play America's game." But behind the scenes, the Bureau of Prisoner Affairs monitored these activities carefully. Recreation wasn't charity. It was strategy, keeping prisoners occupied, maintained discipline, and demonstrated American confidence. The message was subtle but deliberate. Freedom was structured. Order came through choice. Even the act of swinging a bat carried political weight. One War Department memorandum from 1944 stated, "Participation in recreational programs has proven effective in fostering respect for democratic habits." The Germans could not know that their evening games in the Texas heat would one day echo far from the barbed wire. But the seeds of cultural exchange were already planted as the first winter of captivity approached and the fields turned brown. They continued to play wearing gloves repaired with shoelaces and bats taped at the handles. A German captain watching from the sidelines remarked quietly to a guard in English, "Maybe this is how you win wars, not with whores, but with games." February 1944. Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The snow came down in thin, dry sheets across the barbed wire. The prisoners cleared it from the infield with brooms made from bundled twigs. When they were done, a rectangle of brown dirt sat in the middle of a white field. The German POW Baseball League of Fort Robinson was ready for its first game. The cold didn't matter. They were bored and restless. The war in Europe was still raging, but here routine ruled work details in the morning, classes in English after lunch, and recreation before dusk. There were enough men and enough time to build a proper league. The U.S. Army had realized something important by then. Baseball worked. The 1943 recreation experiment in the southern camps had produced measurable results: fewer discipline problems, fewer escape attempts. So in early 1944, the War Department standardized sports programs in every major POW installation. The instructions were detailed. Each camp was to provide baseball diamonds, at least 2 sets of gloves per team, a supply of baseballs, and rulebooks in German. The YMCA and the National Recreation Association shipped thousands of bats, gloves, and uniforms marked P/WUs. Red Cross records show more than 10,000 pieces of athletic equipment delivered to POW camps in the United States that year alone. Camp officers wrote reports back to Washington describing how quickly the Germans took to the game. They were methodical. They read the rule book line by line, assigned umpires, and practiced drills like soldiers. American guards coached them in fielding and pitching. Most of the men had never seen a curveball before, but by the end of spring, they could throw one. The game began to spread north and west to camps in Kansas, Colorado, Minnesota, and Idaho. By summer 1944, baseball diamonds dotted the American landscape behind barbed wire fences. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, which held more than 4,000 Germans, an entire field complex was constructed by the prisoners themselves with lumber from the camp's sawmill. The field included bleachers made of pine planks, chalk lines, and even a scoreboard. They painted Deutsche Baseball-Liga, Lager Concordia, across a sheet of canvas and hung it behind home plate. On weekends, hundreds of prisoners gathered to watch. American guards sold popcorn and soft drinks through the fence. It became a spectacle that locals talked about. One Kansas newspaper ran a photo of the field under the headline, "Nazis play American game and love it." Some of the men took it more seriously than others. In Camp Hearn, Texas, a Luftwaffe pilot named Horst Raschke kept a small notebook filled with statistics, batting averages, errors, and strikeouts. He wrote in careful script, "Discipline and teamwork are the same as flying." Others saw it as something deeper. A camp teacher running a discussion group for re-education wrote that baseball had become a language lesson in democracy. Each man had to play by the rules, wait his turn, and rely on others. The point system rewarded patience, not aggression. Records from the War Department's Special Projects Division confirmed that the idea soon became official policy. Beginning in mid-1944, American officers used sports to promote what they called positive contact. Baseball games between German and American teams were organized in several large camps under supervision. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the 1944 summer tournament included mixed teams of guards and prisoners. At Camp Phillips, Kansas, the final score of the championship game was recorded in the camp bulletin. Germans 8, Yanks 6. Mutual applause at end of game. The Germans studied the sport with the same precision they had once applied to engineering and tactics. They measured bat length and weight, calculated throwing arcs, and even built a small pitching machine out of spare springs from a truck. A Red Cross inspector visiting Camp Algona, Iowa, wrote in his report, "In place of political arguments, they now debate baseball rules." By autumn 1944, organized baseball among prisoners had become one of the largest athletic programs ever conducted under the Geneva Convention system. The numbers are clear. Out of approximately 380,000 German prisoners held in the continental United States, over 65% participated in some form of athletics, and more than half of those played baseball, at least occasionally. That means over 120,000 Germans had learned the basics of the game before the war ended. American officers began to see the results not just in morale, but in attitude. Prisoners who played were more cooperative in work details, more willing to join language classes, and less hostile toward guards. One report from Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, read, "Baseball has become a social solvent." The phrase appeared again later in War Department summaries. Letters that slipped through censorship often carried references to it. A sergeant wrote to his family in Hamburg, "We play the American sport now. It is difficult but fair. You can lose honorably." Another wrote, "This country plays games as seriously as we fight wars. That is perhaps their strength." By the end of 1944, POW teams had nicknames, uniforms sewn from scrap fabric, and rivalries. At Camp Atterbury, Indiana, the guards built a small trophy from scrap aluminum marked Lager Champions 1944. When a delegation of War Department officials toured that fall, they found 2 games in progress and hundreds of spectators cheering in German and English alike. An officer wrote in his notes, "Discipline perfect, spirit excellent, order maintained by the game itself." As the war turned against Germany in Europe, these camps became laboratories of adjustment. The sport that had begun as an amusement was now a kind of re-education. A subtle exchange was happening through muscle memory rather than lectures. Each inning taught timing, restraint, and fair play, values that propaganda could never erase, but experience could teach. And when 1945 arrived, bringing with it surrender and the slow process of repatriation, many of these men realized they had learned something unexpected behind the wire. Not just a sport, but a pattern of thinking that they would carry home. May 1945. The war in Europe ended, and with it the legal status of hundreds of thousands of German prisoners scattered across the United States, Britain, and Canada. The U.S. camps began preparing for repatriation. Trains carried men to East Coast ports where Liberty ships waited to take them back across the Atlantic. Each departure was recorded in precise Army paperwork, names, ranks, home districts, and a column titled Education and Skills. In thousands of cases, clerks added a note that would have made no sense 3 years earlier: baseball experience. When the first groups disembarked in France for transfer to Allied-controlled Germany, they were processed through reorientation centers. Among them were dozens of former players from camps in Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska. The U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division took special interest in them. Records from the headquarters of U.S. Forces European Theater dated July 1945 list: recreational supplies shipped to temporary enclosures at Remagen, Augsburg, and Stuttgart, gloves, bats, and rule pamphlets in German. The purpose was practical. Recreation kept returning soldiers occupied during screening and interrogation. But the effect was cultural. Men who had played in America began teaching others. By September 1945, informal games were being played on open fields near Augsburg, Hanover, and Frankfurt. War correspondent Paul Schwerin wrote for a German-language paper printed under American supervision that young men now swing bats made from broom handles and use softballs sewn from rags. They say this is the American prisoner's game. Photographs taken by Army photographers show former prisoners in mismatched uniforms drawn from captured stocks, playing beneath handmade backstops. There are American guards watching, not with rifles, but with clipboards. The U.S. military government encouraged it. The Information Control Division, responsible for cultural reorientation, saw baseball as a harmless introduction to American norms. Official correspondence from November 1945 directed field officers to promote supervised recreation of athletic character, emphasizing cooperative and rule-based activity. Baseball fit that description precisely. The same War Department that had once listed the game as prisoner recreation now listed it as occupation policy. Equipment was scarce, but improvisation came naturally. Former POWs who had worked in U.S. camp workshops began producing their own bats from German ash and beechwood. Gloves were repaired with shoelaces and bicycle tire rubber. American units stationed nearby sometimes donated gear from post exchanges. In the 3rd Army's occupation zone, Major Robert Dupree, a former high school coach from Kentucky, organized what may have been the first structured post-war baseball league on German soil. 6 teams competed in 1946, 2 American service teams, and 4 composed largely of former prisoners who had learned the game in captivity. By the summer of 1946, baseball diamonds appeared on abandoned parade grounds in Mannheim, Augsburg, and Bremerhaven. An American Stars and Stripes article from August 18th that year carried the headline, "Germans play our game, and play it well." The reporter described crowds of children watching Germans in surplus U.S. Army uniforms sliding into base under the late summer sun. The article quoted one player, a former Wehrmacht sergeant from Kassel, saying in English, "It is strange but good to play something that was once forbidden." The sport spread quickly along the occupation zones because of the thousands of returning men who had been held in the United States. In total, About 370,000 German prisoners had been interned there between 1942 and 1945. Of those, approximately 200,000 returned to the American zone of Germany. Statistical surveys conducted by the Office of Military Government show that 60% of returning POWs had participated in camp recreation programs, and a third of those had played baseball at least once. It was enough to seed an entire sporting culture. Local recreation officers began organizing leagues under German management by 1947. In Heidelberg, the Rhine-Main League was formed with 4 teams: the Frankfurt Eagles, Mannheim Red Sox, Heidelberg Yankees, and Wiesbaden Cardinals. The names reflected the American units that had sponsored them. Early scores were printed in bilingual newspapers distributed by the occupation forces. The rulebooks used were translations of the 1943 War Department Manual. Games were umpired jointly by U.S. soldiers and German players to ensure fairness and to continue the lessons of order and sportsmanship that had begun behind barbed wire. Letters from American soldiers stationed in Germany mention the novelty of seeing former enemies playing baseball. One sergeant wrote home to Illinois, "It's odd watching them argue balls and strikes instead of politics. They even have their own fans now." The crowds included local civilians, many seeing the sport for the first time. Children imitated the motions with sticks and stones. These early teams laid the groundwork for formal organizations that would appear a few years later. The first German Baseball Federation traces its origins to 1948, when occupation authorities began transferring control of recreation to local clubs. By then, baseball diamonds existed in at least 20 towns across the American zone. The U.S. Army provided surplus uniforms, bases, and maintenance tools. Instructional films, originally made for prisoner camps, were reused to teach civilians. What had begun as a pastime for captured soldiers had become a new post-war sport. More important, it functioned as cultural repair. The men who played no longer defined themselves by military ranks, but by batting orders and team names. One of them, former artilleryman Hans Neumann, later wrote in a memoir published in 1972, "We came home with more than memories of defeat. We brought a game that taught us discipline without hate." Spring 1947. The occupation zones were reorganizing under civilian control. The U.S. military government had begun transferring administration of local sports and education to German committees that could function without direct supervision. Baseball was one of the few activities that required almost no bureaucracy. It already existed in dozens of towns maintained by former prisoners of war and aided by American recreation officers. The Army kept records of it all. The Information Control Division filed a statistical digest that spring listing team sports introduced by U.S. forces. Baseball appeared second only to soccer, with 214 teams registered across the American zone. The structure was simple. Each team formed from workplace groups or displaced persons. Camps played others within a short rail distance. Matches were arranged on weekends, on fields that had once been parade grounds or bombed lots, raked flat. Children helped mark lines with lime powder borrowed from the local construction sites. The U.S. forces provided whatever equipment they could spare. The 98th Quartermaster Depot in Bremen listed 1,600 gloves and 400 bats distributed between January and December 1947. Most came from American high schools and community clubs that donated used gear through the National Recreation Association's Sports for Peace campaign. That same year, the Army's Special Services Division arranged exhibition games between service teams and German civilian clubs. To encourage interest, the 1st Infantry Division's team, the Red One Giants, toured Nuremberg, Würzburg, and Augsburg, playing against mixed squads of Germans and American dependents. Attendance was recorded at over 30,000 across the series. Tickets were free, and the events were heavily photographed for stars and stripes. One caption from July 1947 reads, "Former POW pitchers take mound for peace." The effect on the German players was lasting. Many had spent years inside American camps, where baseball fields had been as common as fences. Now they were on the other side of the wire wearing gloves instead of numbers on sleeves. The same rules applied, and the same arguments about strikes and safe calls filled the air. Some of those players later became coaches for youth leagues, sponsored by the YMCA and the German Sports Federation. Statistics compiled by the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany show that by 1950 there were organized baseball leagues in Stuttgart, Frankfurt, Munich, and Kassel, each maintaining regular season schedules from April to September. Across Europe, similar patterns appeared. Former prisoners transferred from the U.S. to Britain and Canada had carried the game with them to camps in Scotland and Wales. When they returned home, they founded teams in northern Germany and Austria. By 1949, the British Control Commission was reporting friendly matches between English and German teams in Hamburg and Bremen. American occupation officers saw it as quiet proof of integration. One memorandum from that year in the archives of the State Department stated, "American sport has served as both example and bridge." There was a practical side to the policy, too. Baseball diamonds built on military bases were multi-purpose. They served for softball games for troops and for physical training in German schools. The U.S. Army Engineering Corps even published a small construction guide called Temporary Baseball, Diamond Layout for Overseas Stations, based on designs from the wartime prisoner of war camps. The dimensions remained the same, 90 feet between bases. 400 feet to the outfield fence, those numbers became the metric standard adopted by early German leagues, translated as 27.43 meters and 121.92 meters. The precision impressed local engineers. One wrote in a regional paper, "The Americans measure games as exactly as they build bridges." American corporations also took notice. Caterpillar and General Motors sponsored community projects, providing funds for sports fields near their new assembly plants in West Germany. These donations often included baseball facilities, which the companies described as goodwill gestures, but they were also advertisements for American products, and culture employees and local youth teams played together on weekends. Company newsletters from 1948 and 1949 featured photographs of German employees wearing caps marked GM Baseball Club. For German civilians still struggling with rationing and rebuilding, these events were moments of normalcy. Photographs from U.S. Information Service archives show mixed crowds of Americans and Germans sitting together on makeshift bleachers watching baseball under a clear post-war sky. No flags, no propaganda. Just a game played by men who a few years earlier would have been enemies. The statistics from that period are clear. Between 1945 and 1950, at least 500 organized baseball teams operated within Germany and Austria, most with direct roots in the prisoner of war education programs. That made baseball the only major American sport to take hold organically in post-war Europe through direct human contact rather than imported media. By the end of 1950, the first German-language baseball handbook was published in Munich, compiled by 3 former prisoners and translated by an American Army chaplain. It was titled Das Baseballspiel, Regeln und Taktik. The introduction read simply, "We learned this game while behind wire fences in a faraway land. It taught us patience and fairness. Now we teach it to our sons." Summer 1951, Germany was changing. The Marshall Plan had pumped money and machinery into West German industry. Cities were rebuilding, the rubble of the old world was turning into highways and factories, yet traces of the war lingered in the oddest places, in clearings at the edges of towns, in meadows beside new housing blocks. Faint lines in the grass marked old baseball diamonds. They had been leveled and forgotten by many, but not by the men who had once played there. In April that year, the first West German baseball championship was held in Mannheim under the supervision of the newly founded Deutscher Baseball and Softball Verband, the German Baseball and Softball Federation. The federation's first president, Wilhelm Heidkamp, had been a prisoner at Camp Concordia, Kansas. His secretary, Hans Neumann, the former artilleryman who had spoken of discipline without hate, was the tournament umpire. 4 teams competed, all with names borrowed from American major leagues: the Stuttgart Tigers, Frankfurt Red Sox, Mannheim Yankees, and Heidelberg Giants. The tournament drew a few hundred spectators, mostly Americans from nearby bases and curious locals, but it marked something no one could have imagined in 1943. A German sports league born directly from prisoner of war experience. American newspapers barely noticed. Stars and Stripes printed a 2-paragraph story under the heading, "Former Prisoners Play for Pennant." The U.S. Army kept an eye on it, however. Internal reports noted that baseball continued to serve as a positive factor in civilian relations. At the height of the Cold War, that was no small thing. West Germany was now a frontline ally, and American culture, through film, music, and sport, was a subtle weapon in its own right. Baseball had become part of that soft power, spreading the quiet language of rule, fairness, and cooperation that the U.S. Information Agency called democratic recreation. Through the 1950s, American military teams continued to play against German clubs, providing coaching and equipment. German players learned new tactics from servicemen who had played semi-professionally before enlisting. School programs followed. By 1955, the first youth leagues opened in Hamburg and Frankfurt. The sport never reached the scale of soccer, but it found a loyal following. Every new generation of German players could trace their club's founding back to a single phrase: "We learned from the prisoners." Historians would later quantify the phenomenon. A 1988 study by the German Sports University in Cologne calculated that 72% of all baseball clubs founded before 1960 had a founding member who had been a prisoner of war in the United States. Their notebooks and photos preserved proof. Many had kept the original War Department rulebooks marked P/W. One such book, now displayed in the Deutsches Sport and Olympia Museum in Cologne, still carries a name scrawled in pencil on the inside cover: Feldwebel K. Ritter, Camp Hearn, Texas, 1944. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, an exhibition in Berlin titled Games Behind Barbed Wire opened with artifacts from American and German archives. Visitors saw photographs of young men in U.S. Army-issue baseball uniforms standing in front of watchtowers, smiling. Beneath one image was a simple caption: Texas, 1944, Enemy Players. For many Germans, it was the first time they had seen this part of history presented not as humiliation, but as transformation. Today, baseball remains a small but steady sport in Germany. The Bundesliga season runs from April to October. Fields in Bonn, Regensburg, and Heidenheim are kept to precise American dimensions: 90 feet between bases, 400 feet to center field. German players wear jerseys printed with English terms: pitcher, shortstop, catcher. Words inherited unchanged from the language of their former guards. In interviews with the last surviving veterans of those wartime camps, one theme recurs. They do not speak much about ideology or politics. They speak about the noise of a ball hitting a glove, the dust rising from the infield, the sound of laughter that crossed the wire. It was the first time we were equals, one said. There was no rank, no victory, no defeat, just the game. For the U.S. military and for the German players alike, that may have been the truest victory of all, not one measured in ground gained or cities taken, but in a simple act repeated 1,000 times from Texas to Bavaria. A man lifting a bat, waiting for the pitch, and running toward home. Thanks for listening till the end. I put a lot of effort to bring you factually correct and lesser-known stories of the past. Subscribe my channel if you like this type of content.